Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first entry in the PONARS Eurasia Policy Exchange series, hosted by, obviously, PONARS Eurasia. We're delighted that so many of you can join us this morning, this afternoon, this evening. We have people across many different time zones joining us. We're here to discuss Ukraine's security going forward, and I should introduce myself. My name is David Ciccone. I am an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University and associate director of PONARS Eurasia. I'm joined by 6 esteemed experts of both Ukrainian politics, post-Soviet politics, and international relations to discuss a question that's really on everyone's mind the last 100 days. No matter how this atrocious war that's now 3 months in ends, how can Ukraine's long-run security realistically be guaranteed? So what we've done in this policy exchange series is invited both PONARS members and friends and other experts to contribute their thoughts to this central question in the form of short memos, which you can find on our website, which I hope we can share in the chat. So all 6 people on this call, when there are 2 teams of 2 and 2 individual contributions, thought through this question and shared their thoughts in a short memo. But what's interesting about this policy exchange is that we also shared the memos between the experts and the participants before publishing. So they've had a chance to read one another's thoughts and respond to them in writing. So this is truly a way to spark a discussion about how Ukraine's security can be guaranteed from a variety of different perspectives. And we're hoping that this event not only serves to launch the memos, which can be found on our website, but also kind of generate some good discussion and debate about the various proposals. And I doubt we'll come to any consensus over the course of the next hour and a half, but it should be a fun exercise to think through many of the possible scenarios that could lead to more peaceful outcomes going forward and deter this kind of aggression. So without further ado, I'd like to begin the event by turning the floor over to each of the author sets in turn, who will have about 10 minutes to present their arguments, which mostly I'm sure can be found in the memos. Then we'll have a bit of chance to kind of digest and offer some questions for them to speak to one another, and we'll open up to the audience for the last 45 minutes for questions from all of you. We have a chat function, so please enter your questions either directly to me or within the chat function, and we'll get to them as soon as we get through the presentation. So each group will have about 10 minutes. I will introduce the authors in turn. We're going to start with Petro Burkovskyi, who's the executive director of the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, and Olexiy Haran, who's the professor of political or comparative politics at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Petro and Olexiy, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello. As we say now, good morning. We are from Ukraine. Hi everybody. And I believe this is my personal contribution to greet you, and Petro's contribution is to present our memo, right?
Thank you, Olexiy. I also join your congratulations, and it's a real pleasure to speak to the other authors and debate about the very interesting issue. So let me just start. Our memo is about the outcome of the war, and we started our memo from the several assumptions. And these are, we argue that the current war, which is going on between Ukraine and Russia, it's not unique, as every war, it starts with because of their miscalculations, gross multiple miscalculations. First, the West was wrong about nature of Putin's regime and his intentions toward the Ukraine and towards the Eastern Europe. Putin was wrong about the nature of Ukrainian statehood and the intentions of the Ukrainian people, and Ukraine was wrong about both, and now it pays a great price for its miscalculations. Despite the very early warning signs, the West ignored the authoritarian tendencies in Russia and the plans which Russian leadership for the last 20 years has been developing toward its neighbors. And it was also true that many politicians in the West and many leaders in the West, they considered Russian claims over Ukraine as legitimate. And moreover, Ukraine was viewed as a Russian satellite, as a weak, underdeveloped, corrupted country, which is a satellite and which struggles to leave the Russian orbit. And just a quick reference, you may read the testimonies of Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary to the State Department, to the Secretary of the State Department, State Secretary, sorry, during the hearings at the Senate Committee for the Foreign Affairs. She called the Ukraine the vassal state of Russia in 2016. So meanwhile, in the last 20 years, Ukraine has been living through the very dramatic internal changes. In a nutshell, it has becoming more free than Russia and becoming stronger and stronger, resisting against Russian attempts to subdue it. And we wrote that it was Putin who made NATO great again. And we presented the results of the opinion polls in 2008 until the very moment of the war, which shows how Russian assertiveness pushed Ukrainians toward joining NATO. And if in 2012 only 13% of Ukrainians supported the integration to NATO, in December 2021, 53% of Ukrainians supported Ukraine's joining NATO, and that's all because of the Russian threats and Russian aggressiveness. And furthermore, we argue that the Russian aggression in 2014 against Ukraine only cemented decision of Ukraine to move closer to EU and NATO and become a member of EU and NATO. And we argue that, and we show that the Ukrainian reaction to Russian policy is not unique. Baltics did the same, made the same decision in the 90s, and Sweden and Finland has just made the same decision to join NATO because of the Russian aggression. And so what we discuss is that this picture and the current war leaves the West, the key Western powers, with very few options. The first, we call it a deliberate de-escalation and diplomatic brinkmanship, meaning the diplomatic efforts to contain Russia. Still, there are attempts to set scene for the peace talks with Putin, but as it can seem that everybody who pursues it among European leaders, they all have different goals with very few common things, which is to avoid nuclear conflict, to give Putin some concessions that would make him that he is not defeated, to seem that he is not defeated, and the last one is that still to keep Ukraine independent. And we think that leaving Putin undefeated and keeping Ukraine independent, it's almost inconceivable and impossible. Therefore, we put an argument in favor of the second option, which is another version of the Iron Curtain, isolating Russia, and which includes total energy embargo, total trade embargo, and increase of defense spending. But first and foremost, the swift and the massive delivery of weapons to Ukraine in order to help Ukraine to win a decisive victory in this war as quickly as possible and force Russia to the peace talks. Because we argue, and then we responded to the several points in the memos of our colleagues, that only decisive Ukrainian victory would make Ukraine confident that it can survive in the future and rebuild itself, restore its economy and defense, national defense, before Russia would be ready to start another invasion and to start another war. And of course, the best option is to for Ukraine to enter NATO, because this is the only alliance that Russia would not, as we think, is that Russia is not likely to attack.
Thank you very much. Our next presenters are going to be Mariya Popova, who's the Jean Monnet Chair and Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University in Montreal, and Oksana Shevel, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University.
Hi, everyone. So Oksana and I have divided our duties for this event, and I'll start with presenting our memo. So we think that Ukraine's long-term security needs to rest on three pillars. Without one of them, it would crumble. And those three pillars are a full military defeat of Russia in the current war. So pushing Russia off all the territories it took after February 24th. A Western realization that there can be no return to cooperation and interdependence with autocratic and imperialist Russia, but instead there needs to be a switch back to containment and deterrence. And the third pillar, the gradual integration of Ukraine into first the EU and eventually NATO as well. So let me talk a bit more about these three pillars. Now, the first pillar, we very much agree with Petro and Olexiy that there is a need for a full military defeat in this portion of the war, in the territories that Russia has taken over since February. It is necessary for Russia to feel defeated in this attempt in order for any hope to actually start, for any hope that an end of hostilities is not going to be a temporary ceasefire, but an actual peace. It has to start from Russia being pushed off of these territories. Now, what we argue in the memo is that Ukraine reclaiming Crimea and Donbass, the part of Donbass that has been under Russia's control since 2014, is more complicated for several reasons, for escalation reasons, also for the fact that Russia has had 8 years to entrench itself in those territories. We can discuss this a bit more in the Q&A, but the core of the first pillar is defeat in the February 22 occupied territories. Now, the second pillar of Ukraine's long-term security is a clear realization by everyone in the West, or a majority in the West, which we don't have at this point, that after the war is over, if Russia continues to be an autocratic and imperialist regime, so under operating this assumption that Russia continues in its current regime form, there should be no return to cooperation and engagement. What we argue is that this war has demonstrated that the policy of cooperation and engagement over the last 20 years that the West pursued, McGill has recently talked about it and said that she doesn't regret this policy, but in fact, it was a mistaken policy. It has so it needs to be changed and revised. A return to cooperation, we think, will undermine Ukrainian security because it will signal again that the West is weak, ready to cooperate with Russia, ready to cede to some Russian demands. We think Russia's goals in Ukraine will not actually change dramatically as long as it remains an autocratic and imperialist regime. So it needs to be deterred and not convinced or moderated, because we know that policy failed. So the elements of this realization is that indeed sanctions should remain in force until Russia for as long as Russia occupies Ukrainian territory. There should be no energy trade or return to energy trade. There should be policies to make sure that Russian oligarchs cannot continue to function in the West, policies to ensure Russia cannot be funding political parties in the West, policies to counter Russian disinformation. A concerted effort to deter and contain Russia rather than return to cooperation. And the third pillar is Ukraine's gradual integration into European and Western writ large organizations, the EU first and eventually NATO. We argue in the memo that Ukraine has already made good reforms, institutional reforms in the last 8 years. Before the war, there was recognition that a lot of institutions were established following best practices, but the criticism was that the political will was lacking to actually use these institutions to make great leaps towards the rule of law, towards controlling corruption, strengthening the state. But what we argue is that after the war, the political will be in place. We know that Ukraine is very united now around a European Western orientation. This will imbue political will into making the most of the institutions that are already in place. If Ukraine is given EU candidate status, European Union conditionality will kick in. We know that it has achieved results in Eastern Europe, even if they're mixed. But this is one way to enhance Ukraine's security. And finally, the issue of NATO membership. And we do argue that eventually Ukraine needs to be integrated into NATO, because this is the only way to achieve long-term security. Obviously, the timing of this NATO integration will be the trickiest part. But what we argue in the memo is that ad hoc security guarantees will be will either not be as strong and as credible, or potentially, if they are just reinventing the wheel of NATO membership. We think that NATO membership for Ukraine would actually signal in a way to Russia that Ukraine will not be attacking Russia because of mutual deterrence. And we think that without NATO membership, Russia may again miscalculate in the same way that it miscalculated in February 22, that perhaps the West's commitment to defending Ukraine is not very strong. The West is divided, and it may actually increase the likelihood of another invasion. So I'll end here, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Mariya. Our next panelist will be Mariya Omelicheva, who is professor of professor of strategy at the National War College. Mariya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. And I also want to begin by thanking my colleagues for putting together rather thoughtful proposals that truly have Ukraine's best interests front and center. And let me just say that I also want to express my admiration for my Ukrainian colleagues who continue carrying out their professional and citizenship duties under some of the harshest circumstances. So, well, my proposal is slightly different. different. So it's premised on the idea of self-defense rather than collective defense. And this proposal is motivated primarily by two concerns. The first concern is with the feasibility of Ukraine's membership in NATO. And the second one is with whether membership in the security alliance actually makes Ukraine immune to the eventuality of the future attack from Russia. So as Mariya already alluded, in the immediate future, in the short run, Ukraine's membership in NATO or meaningful security guarantees by the United States or UK will face very serious obstacles. We've heard already that there has been kind of little appetite in Washington and London to provide Kyiv with the legally binding protections that the Ukrainian government has asked for. And even though it is possible for a country at war to be admitted to NATO, it will require quite some time and very careful diplomacy. And we know that a prolonged admission process can make NATO aspirants particularly vulnerable to kinetic or gray zone attacks from Moscow. And also, the more this process of admission lasts, the more likely that it is going to be hijacked by some kinds of domestic processes, vicissitudes in the member states of NATO. Furthermore, in my opinion, NATO's collective defense does not effectively safeguard Ukraine from Russia's future aggression. It is true that NATO's combined military capabilities exceed those of Russia. There are, however, acknowledged and serious challenges mobilizing those capabilities swiftly, maneuver, right, and conducting large-scale combat operations. Today, the alliance continues relying on the much weaker force posture in the eastern flank and much stronger posture in the western flank. So it is what is known as deterrence by reinforcement. What it means is that if the eastern flank gets attacked, then it buys some time for these troops from the western flank be moved forward and to counter the aggressor. But so to me, until NATO shifts from this deterrence by reinforcement to deterrence by denial, membership in the Northern Alliance does not prevent the kind of horrific destruction of a sovereign territory by a determined aggressor that we've witnessed. So it is because of these two considerations that I've chosen to propose to draw on some of the lessons from Ukraine's security cooperation with the West since 2014, and also, of course, Ukrainian army's heroic and skillful performance that we witnessed over the course of this war, using those as guides for developing its self-defense strategy that will be uniquely tailored to Ukraine's security needs. I want to underscore that Ukraine is not going to be alone in building these self-defense capabilities. Kyiv's self-defense strategy will be not carried in isolation, but with the Western support, security assistance from the United States, NATO partners, but also non-NATO partners, including Israel, as an example. And so I put forth 4 pillars for such a self-defense strategy. The first priority will be to build a robust air defense system, the kind of Ukrainian-owned A2AD, the anti-access and anti-denial defense, featuring a mix of anti-aircraft, surface-to-air, and possibly even anti-ship systems. And I can go into this into a Q&A, but this kind of robust air defense system may even protect the Ukrainian territory from the carnage of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons. And it will also allow Ukraine to collaborate with a wide range of partners for procuring military technologies that will be much better tailored to Ukraine's security needs. The second priority will lie with continuous military modernization and training of the Ukrainian troops for operating procured in the West advanced military technologies, and also capitalizing on Ukraine's own rather robust arms industry that should be continuously invested in to develop those homegrown military and cyber technologies. And so to me, by investing in its own solutions to some of its military needs, Kyiv will be more responsible or more responsive and adaptable to future security threats. And a couple other pillars. So the third one will be, of course, to continue boosting Ukraine's intelligence and cyber capabilities by upgrading its own intelligence services and establishing and maintaining intelligence sharing partnerships with the United States and other partners. And the last one, which is very, very important, it is to continue investing in expanding, training, and arming the Volunteer Territorial Defense Forces, TDF. So the Territorial Defense Forces were stood up a few months before Russia's aggression, and they proved to be indispensable to denying Russia's ability to seize some of the Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv. However, we also saw that some of the limitations of these forces had to do with the fact that there were many more Ukrainian volunteers to defend their home country than weapons to arm them or training available to them. There has also been scarcity of non-commissioned officers to lead these troops for tactical operations or serve as vital links with the military. And I think this can be another very key component of Ukraine's self-defense that Ukraine and Western partners should continue investing in and capitalizing on. And so kind of to conclude, I titled my proposal Fortress Ukraine. And I concluded by saying that, Fortress Ukraine may not get a seat at NATO's table, but it has all ingredients to develop future security based on the principle of self-defense. It will be grounded in the Ukrainian people's willingness to fight for their country's freedom and independence, matched by its ability to do so, built around the partnership and assistance from the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariya. And our final speaker will be Paul Dianieri, who is the professor of political science and public policy at the University of California, Riverside. Paul.
Thanks, David. And thanks to everyone for being here, and especially to my colleagues who've written these thoughtful proposals that I think have left me relatively little to say, because I do agree with a lot of what's been said, but I'll try to find some nuances and point out some of the differences. So my perspective, first of all, is based in reading I've been doing in the literature on commitment in conflict resolution. Peace agreements fail when the commitments in them aren't credible. Minsk failed because it was based on a whole bunch of commitments that neither side really wanted to implement or could be compelled to implement. And we can look at the previous security commitments that have been made to Ukraine over the year, whether it's the Budapest Memorandum or the so-called 1997, the big treaty. The conversation so far, and we've seen this in other places as well, tends to treat NATO membership and building up a robust Ukrainian armed forces as either or. You can get Ukraine security this way, or you can get it that way. And I want to make the case that they are complementary. I would point to Germany. Germany's obviously a member of NATO, but suddenly decided to spend a lot more money on weapons. The flip side of that is Finland and Sweden, with pretty robust defense capabilities, deciding they want to be in NATO as well. The both and approach seems to be what most countries are finding is necessary, and I think there are reasons for that. So let me focus in on why I think, even if we're going to build this fortress Ukraine that Mariya Omelicheva talks about, why NATO membership is so important for Ukraine. It's because other kinds of securities are much less effective. And that's not because there's something magical about the Article 5 commitment. The Article 5 commitment could be violated anytime somebody chooses to, but it's what happens to the security of the others if it is violated. All the members of NATO that rely on NATO, right, suddenly have to look after their own security, not only from Russia, but from each other if Article 5 goes away, or if it's seen to be just paper. So currently, there are a lot of perceived tensions between the interests of some in Western Europe, at least, and Ukraine. And what NATO membership does, it aligns those interests. And in particular, if there's going to be this kind of fortress Ukraine, it relies on a commitment by NATO and others over many, many years, decades, to continue to sustain Ukraine in building this defense capacity. And there's no reason for Ukraine to think that that's a credible commitment, or for Russia to think it's a credible commitment, or for others at some point 10 years later not to walk away from it, because it's going to be very expensive. unless there's something that's done to align the security interests of Ukraine with those of Western Europe and elsewhere. And I'm sorry if you can hear noise behind me, but it's 7 o'clock in the morning here and they're trimming the hedges outside my window. It's also the case that if Ukraine gains the ability to fight Russia without NATO's help, if we make up for NATO membership instead with a massively arming Ukraine, that actually gives Ukraine a lot more latitude to choose when it wants to engage Russia and on what terms. And depending on where you stand, that could either be a very good thing or a very dangerous thing. But I simply want to point out, and this is very paradoxical, Russia's actually safer with a well-armed Ukraine integrated into NATO than it is with a well-armed Ukraine not integrated into NATO. And I don't expect the Russians to agree with that anytime soon. But actually, I think NATO is safer with a well-armed Ukraine integrated into NATO, constrained by NATO, than with a well-armed Ukraine not integrated into NATO. Ultimately, it's probably going to be political considerations, not the kind of strategy that I'm talking about that's going to dictate whether Ukraine gets a NATO membership offer. But I think we should be aware of these consequences. Another thing that came up in the memos that I want to highlight is that there is some tension between getting to a peace agreement and getting Ukraine into NATO, because many suggestions for a peace agreement recommend surrendering, at least in the medium term, some Ukrainian territory, or at least acknowledge that it's not going to be regained right away, and particularly Crimea, but a lot of people are talking about a lot more territory as well. And Burkovskyi and Haran in their memo point out that Ukraine is much more likely to accept territorial loss if they get NATO membership in return. The problem with that, of course, is that NATO has long had this sort of doctrine. I don't think it's formal, but this idea that we're not going to bring in states that have ongoing territorial disputes. And so there's a little bit of clash there between the pragmatism of you make some sort of deal, we'll let you into NATO, but you have to give some territory away in order to foster peace. And we don't want countries in that have ongoing territorial disputes. I think the only way that gets resolved is if there's actually a treaty that everybody signs on to that actually cedes Ukrainian territory to Russia. And I'm not sure anybody's ready for that yet. Lastly, a point that Mariya Popova made and that she and Oksana Shabel made in their paper that I just want to stress is EU membership is so important. If you look at the post-communist democracies, an EU membership perspective and deep EU engagement has been crucial in every successful case. It's not an absolute recipe for success, but I don't think there's too many cases, if any, that have succeeded without that deep engagement. And so that has to be part of the package. And if we focus only on the military hardware and not on that political support, I think we're likely to miss something really important, because this is a conflict that is as much about the kind of regime Ukraine is going to have and about the defense of democracy as it is just about territory and geopolitics. In my memo and in talking today, I've tried to stick with what happens after the war and not get too far into talking about what happens during the war itself. But what is possible after the war is entirely dependent on what happens during the war. Currently, the amount of support that the West is giving to Ukraine is sort of the bare minimum necessary for us to envision any of the things that any of us have been talking about. There is an idea out there that making the war easier on Russia by limiting the amount of Western military support for Ukraine will lead to peace sooner. And I just happen to be the opinion of that's dead wrong. It's not going to be reducing Russian casualties or keeping the level of conflict low that's going to convince Russia that it's ready to negotiate a peace. So we really are focusing on what happens after the war, but what happens after the war is always a direct consequence of the results of the war on the ground and the lessons people take from them. So I'll stop there and I will await questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and to all the panelists for sharing their proposals. I'd like to kick things off by submitting a question to all 6 of you. We can go around because it's not something that was raised in any of the memos, but it is in Ukraine's proposal that it submitted during the Istanbul negotiations at the end of March, which is neutrality. This word actually, I don't think appeared in any of the 4 proposals as part of Ukraine's possible long-term security. Where do you come down on the issue of Ukraine committing to long-term neutrality in exchange for security guarantees, either from the West, including Turkey, United States, and other partners, or even from Russia, which has been floated by various actors, if that Russia would guarantee itself to commit to Ukraine's neutrality? So maybe going in the order of the presentations, how do you feel about this aspect or this dimension to the debate on security guarantees? Start with Olexiy and Petro.
Okay, if I may, first of all, we need to differentiate between neutrality and non-block status. I think talk about neutrality is doesn't have any grounds because it limits the possibility for Ukrainian defense. We may talk non-block status is better, but only if we receive real security guarantees. And the question is about guarantees, okay? We have, by the way, when we are talking about Budapest Memorandum, it's interesting that in the English language text, it was about assurances, security assurances. But in Ukrainian and Russian text, it was about guarantee, so guarantees. So, and we understand that Budapest Memorandum didn't guarantee Ukrainian security. So the question is, what kind of guarantees do we need in order to guarantee Ukrainian security in future if Ukraine is non-block status? And whether the Western countries are ready to provide these guarantees, okay? Because there's a question about how serious the West would be, even in case if Ukraine is NATO member. So even bigger question is what kind of guarantees may we expect from the West if we are non-block member. Now, I would like to share with you also the results of our recent poll, because actually we provided this question to Ukrainian audience, and it was face-to-face poll which was conducted in first half of May. So plus it's face-to-face, minus it's limited by the West and the center of Ukraine, but still you may see. So this is joining NATO, 74%, okay? Non-block status, this line, it's only 3%, less than 3%. And then we provided this new option, non-block status, but with guarantees from foreign states, so 13% of Ukrainians. So compare 74% of Ukrainians and 13% who believe that non-block status with guarantees may provide for Ukrainian security. I would also stress that this is interesting result because we have a lot of criticism of NATO in Ukraine since the beginning of the war, that NATO is not effective. We hear it from different sources. We hear it from United Information channels, many speakers on this channel. NATO is not effective, and still Ukrainians do believe, overwhelming majority, that NATO is a source of guarantees and non-block status is not. So I will stop here.
Thank you, very illuminating. Next, Mariya or Oksana.
Yeah, I'll take this one. So thanks for your question, David. I would say when we ask this question, right, like would some other non-block status, neutrality guarantees, there is a broader kind of question within it, like for what purpose, right? And I think that when Ukraine proposed the solution, and this also should keep in mind that was before Bucha and before, you know, what we knew what Russians have been doing in the occupied territories. The overall goal is for Ukraine to be able to act as a quote unquote normal sovereign state, to protect its security, to integrate, in say develop cooperation with the West. And this is exactly what Putin objected to, right? Like, I mean, if you think about, was NATO really ever a realistic possibility for Ukraine? Like, I would say before the war, it wasn't. Mariya and I have written about it, right? Ukraine was not going to join. There was no consensus within NATO about it. Hungary, Germany, you name it, right? So, and yet, things that Ukraine have done, like rebuilding its military, signing association agreement with the EU, wanting to join the EU, basically, Russia found all of these things objectionable, right? So the question is there some arrangement whereby Ukraine can do these things, some things that other panelists recommended, build its army, join the EU, right? Without being threatened to attack by Russia. Hypothetically speaking, and this is, I think, what this agreement, again, at the time when it was first discussed in the peace talks, proposed was, yes, like hypothetically speaking, if Ukraine received assurances, it could happen. But of course, the question is, as we have been discussing, how realistic is it that NATO members who were not willing to admit Ukraine to NATO exactly because they're afraid of confrontation with Russia would actually propose, give Ukraine the kind of security guarantees, right, that would in fact guarantee its security, including military defense in case if it's attacked. That seemed quite unlikely. As Mariya said, it's sort of the way we thought about it, it's more like, if it's either not realistic, then these guarantees are not really sufficient. And if such guarantees were to be provided, that's essentially the same as NATO membership, because it does then bring the possibility that if Ukraine is attacked, there could be direct conflict between NATO and Russia, and that's what NATO wanted to avoid, right? So I think there is this sort of broader context. Within this question. And I would further add that even when this proposal was first discussed back in, I think, March it was, right? The Russian side was already saying that, oh, and by the way, Ukraine has to reduce its military by like 50,000 or something, and they cannot have training exercises without Russia agreeing, essentially having veto powers, right? So the way Russia thought about it, it wasn't just, some sort of non-bloc status, but it was all exactly these limitations on Ukraine being able to act, as a sovereign state, define its interests, protect its interests, pursue this interest, right? But only now it would be under this guise of these supposedly guarantees that in fact would not be guarantees, if even if back then, right, it was arranged in the way that Russia wanted it to have arranged then. I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Can I just add something very quickly, which is that when neutrality for Ukraine is brought up, people oftentimes also bring...
I do also want to underscore the fact. Go ahead, Mariya.
Sorry. When neutrality for Ukraine is brought up, it usually, there are all these examples parallels that get brought up as well, Austria, Switzerland, Finland. And I think we have to remember that Switzerland and Austria are not really good examples at all, should not be thrown into this comparison. They didn't have a major, much bigger country that wanted desperately to invade them. So it's an entirely different situation. The only parallel is Finland, which is why so many people were proposing the Finlandization of Ukraine. But the thing to remember there is that Finland happened only after Russia was defeated in a war, and also in the context of Cold War containment, in which Finland was squarely in the west of the two blocs. So we don't have the broader international system context to use these parallels at all.
Just one sentence. I'm sorry, Mariya. So now we know exactly what Finlandization is. It means pushing the country to join NATO.
Yeah, I just want to foot stomp what Mariya said, that it's important to distinguish neutrality as a political commitment. It is just a political commitment that can be easily reneged on or changed. It is. I think it's one of the weakest political guarantees you can think of. And again, using the case of Finland, Finland had a rather robust military capability. It has had very robust professional military education. It has been integrated with NATO, not being part of NATO, but it has had an element of integration of its military capabilities with Western military capabilities. That is why I think neutrality for Ukraine, short of, it shouldn't preclude developing robust military posture of its own, because it's all it does, it's just a political commitment, as you already alluded to. So, and to me, it's just one of the weakest, probably, ways forward for Kyiv.
Thank you, Paul, and then back to Petro.
Well, yeah, I'll just a couple of points. One is just to agree with Mariya Omelicheva. Non-block status or neutrality might be the default for Ukraine in the end. If NATO doesn't let Ukraine in, then Ukraine will have some kind of non-block status sort of by default. But that's not the same as an active policy of neutrality or a commitment to non-block status. Either way it goes, it's a terrible guarantee of security, because it's basically the absence of security, taking the absence of security and calling it security, which might be nice if your neighbor isn't Russia, but come on. Let's be serious. If Ukraine is going to declare itself neutral or non-block or simply not be admitted to NATO, then it will have to go down the route that Mariya talked about earlier, which is Fortress Ukraine. But in order for that to happen, it will have to be deeply embedded with Western militaries, because for all of Ukraine's military industrial potential, it won't be able to do this itself, either in terms of the technology or production or in terms of the money. So neutrality is really a recipe for Russia reinvading Ukraine 5 or 10 or 20 years down the road. And we shouldn't, I think, kid ourselves about that. The other point I would make is that discussion of Ukraine's block or non-block status is premised upon a complete misdiagnosis of what caused this war in the first place. This war was not about Ukraine's alignment or non-alignment. Ukraine had non-block status in 2014, didn't make much difference. This is about Russia wanting to take control of Ukraine. And Ukraine's neutrality doesn't change that, doesn't change all those historical arguments that Putin makes, and I think increasingly believes. And so to talk about Ukraine's neutrality, it might be necessary in the sense that NATO won't let it in. But it's not actually going to solve any problems.
Thanks, Paul. I think Petro wanted to contribute as well.
No, thank you, David. Paul has just said basic two arguments about that neutrality means the war in the next 5 years, and that really the war was not about the Ukraine joining NATO, but about control of Ukraine. So thank you. I totally agree.
Thanks. And I'd like to take this opportunity to encourage members of the audience to submit questions in the chat. We're going to go to our first one from Susan Stewart, who wants to know how the authors assess the likelihood of Russia using a tactical nuclear weapon on Ukraine, and how the answer to this question figures into their analysis and can affect long-term security.
If I may, David.
Sure, while we're here.
I would just refer Susan Stewart to the fascinating book written by William Odom, The Collapse of the Soviet Military. And there you will find how in the late 70s and in the 80s, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, how the highest military and political command of the Soviet Union planned to use technical nuclear weapons. And actually it was, so it's not, I mean that it was not a kind of threshold not to use the tactical nuclear weapons. The Soviet leaders and in 70s and 80s, and why I'm saying 70s and 80s, these are the time when Vladimir Putin was also part of the system. And I think they talked about this, that technical nuclear weapons should be used in the first day of the war, of the invasion to the West Germany, to make a huge breaches in the defense, where all of the motorized and mechanized Soviet armies would pour and would achieve the La Manche in just 2 weeks. So in Ukraine, you don't need to exploit this kind of opportunity to reach the western border of Ukraine in just 2 weeks. And there is no rationale for use of the technical nuclear weapons against Ukraine, no military rationale, and meaning there is no political rationale for this. the bigger, in my opinion, the biggest threat is that Russia can use the means of delivery of the nuclear weapons like Iskander or cruise missiles to strike the European countries in order to say that they are serious, and that there is the last but one signal that the next time these missiles would carry the nuclear warheads. So stop delivering arms to Ukraine. I think that the countries like Poland, Lithuania, even Sweden and Finland are in more danger.
Thank you. Let me build on Petro's response. So I'm not an expert on tactical or strategic nukes, but I've been thinking about this question as I was working on my memo. And, so the idea for self-defense is partly informed by my reflections on the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And as Petro said, it is about the platforms that can be outfitted with tactical nuclear weapons. And the platform that is more likely to be used is that of Iskander. And currently, I think based on the knowledge that we have, so and that platform, that carrier is very difficult to, it's very evasive. It's very difficult to defend against using the existing air defenses. And there is only one particular drone that has proven to be effective against those missile systems. And those drones are produced by Israel. And so there is limited information on how, Israel drones were used in Armenia, Azerbaijan, were capable of intercepting cruise missiles launched using the Iskander system. And so, and this kind of goes back to my point that, Ukraine needs to look beyond some of the capabilities that the United States has been supplying it with, because the United States acknowledges that it doesn't really have its own kind of tactical nuclear capabilities or ability to intercept those tactical nukes effectively. But there are technologies available there to shop for or acquire, and Israel is one example. But overall, I think it again comes down to building a very, very effective air defense system for Ukraine moving forward.
Thank you, Mariya. Any other panelists want to jump in? Paul.
Yeah, to answer the question directly, it's very difficult to assess the likelihood. I mean, I think we all agree it's extremely unlikely, but is it 1%, 5%, or 0.1%? It's very unlikely until it happens, and then it becomes inevitable, and we'll all say so. I think the interesting question is how it affects strategy, and so far, it's the threat of tactical nuclear weapons has been incredibly effective in terms of deterring Western support for Ukraine. And I think it's to me, it's evidence of why, of how we need to think about the future in which the West is so eager to avoid conflict with Russia. And in this case, doesn't even seem to want to try to deter Russia. And think about how that shapes then this notion of commitments. And who's going to actually keep their commitments when Russia starts threatening things like tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, let alone tactical nuclear weapons or strategic nuclear weapons in Germany or London or Washington. And so I think one of the unfortunate parts of life in the nuclear world, and this has been true since the 1940s, or at least the missile age of the 60s, is that if you can't reduce the risk of being attacked by nuclear weapons to zero without giving your adversary everything they ask for. If you want to push back, you have to accept a non-zero possibility, and that is, famously called, I think, by Oliver Wohlstetter, the threat that leaves something to chance, and that's the realm that we're in now. It does get to another question in the chat, which is the possibility that Ukraine might at some point want to arm itself with nuclear weapons. And frankly, if it's going to go forward dealing with Russia not being part of NATO, that would be a perfectly logical thing to do. But I would also say very unlikely.
Very unlikely. What do the others think about that possibility, building on the desirability, feasibility, probability of Ukraine obtaining nuclear capabilities? How does that fit into this conversation? Any takers?
I'll just maybe second, follow what Paul is saying. I mean, it is indeed, right, like almost ironic, as I think I agree with Paul's earlier point, that he said that Ukraine in NATO may actually be safer, including for Russia, right, than Ukraine outside of NATO, because if Ukraine is left outside of NATO, right, if it does not receive the kind of guarantees and security that, NATO, is meant to provide, it cannot be excluded, right, that it might try to develop nuclear capabilities. Again, for its defense, and we can say, potentially, the more countries have nuclear weapons, the more sort of escalatory potential, even globally speaking, right? So, of course, if that's not a desirable outcome, right, that could be, in fact, potentially a way to avoid that, had Ukraine been in NATO. I don't know, like maybe Olexiy and Petro know more about discussion within Ukraine about developing nuclear capabilities, but certainly there is a lot of sentiment that it was a mistake to give up nuclear weapons that Ukraine inherited from the collapse of the Soviet Union, given where we are now, and given, that the Budapest memorandum turned out to be not worth the paper it's written on, right? Of course, if we sort of go back, we can say that at the time, right, maybe Ukraine didn't actually have a choice, because obviously nobody could predict what Russia would do, many years later. And I think if Ukraine held on to nuclear weapons back then, it wouldn't have received, any assistance. We had economic collapse, so forth. So we can sort of go back and then do history. But I mean, the idea that if the West is not willing and not able to provide guarantees, right, Russia remains imperialistic, aggressive power on Ukraine's borders, bent on destroying the country sovereignty, right? It is not, as Paul said, sort of unreasonable or it would be unexpected if that became a policy in Ukraine, right? And again, ironically, Ukraine and NATO would be a way to avoid that. So just something to think about.
Well, if you allow me to add, I think that the history of the 20th century shows that you either have, as a small nation, you either have a nuclear weapon or you have an economy. As we observe and monitor the conditions and the development of the Ukrainian society and the social change in the Ukrainian society, we see that Ukrainians, even after the war, would choose the economy and development and not the nuclear weapons. Still, we do need a kind of missiles which can reach the Russian territory and destroy the military camps, military bases, and some sensitive assets of Russian army in order to prevent the war. So I think that yes, the short to medium range missiles is a must for Ukraine in any kind of result of the war, but not a nuclear weapon at all. So it's too costly for the nation which is destroyed by the war.
If I may add also, it's not about nuclear weapons. I agree with previous speakers that it's very, it's unrealistic to think about it. The chance of getting nuclear weapon is very low. But regarding the missiles, and as Petro mentioned, short and medium range missiles, we know the debate now about supplying weapons to Ukraine. And many people in the West are saying, no, we cannot provide you with weapons, with long-range artillery, because Ukraine may strike Russia on the Russian soil. And here I would like just to stress once again that we need weapons right now, not to strike Russia on the soil and not to go beyond February 23rd line. We need weapons right now, including long-range artillery, to stop Russian offensive around Severodonetsk and in the Donbass in general. We need it. We have a lack of modern weapons. I've just come back from a volunteer mission in Donbass. So I had a lot of discussions with militaries there, and I saw by my own eyes the old military equipment which is now unpacked in order by Ukrainians. And Russian preponderance is, Russia has not only a lot of long-range artillery, but they have боезаряды, how to say it, боезаряды, shells, no?
Ammunition.
Ammunition, yes. So we do not have enough ammunition. Okay, so the Russian tactic is very simple in the offensive in Severodonetsk, you know, just to shell by artillery and by aviation everything, and then the troops are moving forward, and we do not have enough resources. So in all this discussion about supplying weapons, we need weapons first to stop the offensive now in the Donbass, and then to start to liberate Ukrainian territories. But it's the next task. So don't be afraid now about supplying weapons to Ukraine that we are going to attack Russia. No, we need now to stop Russian aggression here and now in Ukraine. Sorry for emotions.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit from the nuclear question. The contributions are really helpful. I mean, the memos do a nice job of displaying the different arguments about why NATO membership may or may not be on the table and what Ukraine could do in either event. But I'd like to change a little bit to the EU membership, which the authors seem to reach some kind of consensus is necessary and possible. Maybe push back a little bit about that. How serious should we take the overtures from European leaders that Ukraine is close to a fast track, or that the political reforms since 2014 are putting it in a pole position to achieve EU membership? Is this something that the country can rely on? Are these promises are serious, and that even after the war is over, European leaders are going to follow through on some of this positive or optimistic rhetoric about Ukraine joining the EU?
Maybe I can start off this discussion. You know, the rhetoric coming from the EU has been sort of mixed, in fact. You know, some are actually, it's the European Commission that has struck the more optimistic tone. And it's the, you know, the leaders of the big countries that are a lot more cautious. And then we have the Baltics and Central Europe being a lot more supportive. So this will be a push and pull and a very uneven process over the years, for sure. But it is a fact that that Ukraine has reformed in the last 8 years with a view towards meeting European Union requirements. As part of some technical harmonization, they have actually adopted a lot of parts of the acquis so in some ways, the process of accession has already started with the visa-free travel, with the trade association agreement, and the key is receiving candidate status in order to for conditionality to kick in. It will not be necessarily a smooth process, but the point is that it's a meritocratic process. If Ukraine delivers, it will advance. If it doesn't, membership accession negotiations can always freeze. We have examples of that, right? So it is this conditionality that holds the political opportunity to push or to keep Ukraine on a steady course in the next years as it tries to achieve membership. And I think the key here right now is not to prejudge necessarily how long it will take. Is it going to be super fast? Will there be fast tracking? Or is it going to take decades, as Macron said? I think the key now is to open this process and then treat it according to the existing meritocratic criteria, not waive any of them, but that would be the biggest incentive for Ukraine to continue solid reforms.
If I may continue, now let's discuss it pragmatically. So now the necessary step, the first necessary step is to give Ukraine a candidate status. And still we have some kind of debate. No, we should have some conditions for Ukraine to perform in order to receive the candidate status. So I think the country is ripe, both by its development, but also by Ukrainian behavior and behavior of Ukrainians in time of this war. So we proved that we are Europeans, and also we need to, and that's why Ukraine deserves this status, and there's no excuse not to give Ukraine the candidate status. And if Ukraine receives the candidate status, this would be also a clear message to Putin that the West is behind us, but this would be also the message to the Ukrainian society. If we do not receive the candidate status directly, without any conditions, then it would be huge disillusionment in Ukrainian society, dissatisfaction, and even humiliation, I would say. So, you know, Ukrainians are overwhelmingly in favor of the EU. The support is 90% or even more. And yes, so I think there's no excuse, but still we have the kind of debate in the EU states about it, unfortunately.
Can I also just jump in to follow on what Mariya and Olexiy were saying? I think we have, you know, David, with your question, sort of the fast tracking the membership, I think there are three distinct, basically, possibilities that are now on the table, right, or hypothetically discussed. One is some sort of fast track option, which again, you know, sort of raises concerns that that would be some sort of like unjustified gift to Ukraine. If you want to think about it this way, it's not really sustainable because, you know, the country still has to reform, so forth, right? So, and that seems to be like, at least from where things stand now, that's unlikely to happen because the fast tracking, right, that Ukraine would be allowed to skip some of the requirements, right? But that, like, even if we sort of take that off the table, which it seems like, you know, is not going to happen, then I think exactly what Mariya and Olexiy were saying, the actual real candidate status is really what's needed, because that would, first of all, still would ensure that Ukraine has to do the necessary reforms, because EU negotiation accession goes chapter by chapter. You have to close each chapter as a candidate country. It's a very extensive negotiation process. EU has a lot of leverage. You know, some of us studied the accession process for other countries, and it's really a lot, like, you have to fulfill these conditions, you know, and EU basically, if say Ukraine were to backtrack, there was a question, I think from Susan Stewart earlier, you know, about the oligarchs, like if, you know, reforms could be, you know, sidetracked or not sufficient, this would be exactly the safeguard against this, right? Because if, say, certain reforms are not implemented, the chapter would not be closed. If the chapter is not closed, the country can join. So if there is any kind of commitment to reforms, democratization in Ukraine, as far as incentive, that would be really the biggest one, right? And then, but if it didn't happen, as Olexiy was saying, like there is now a talk about creating some sort of additional status, like a candidate for candidate, that would be, you know, bad, not only because, I mean, it would be bad because it essentially, Russia kind of gets its way of preventing Ukraine's European course, but I think it would also be very detrimental for reforms in Ukraine, because, you know, that would only embolden people who would say, like, why should we try to reform, right? Like, if we're not going to get in anyway, I think all these oligarchs, right, like they're going to try to entrench their interests. If you know, one is concerned about, say, democratic backsliding, like, you know, on the media, on the opposition parties, I mean, EU would not have leverage. It would have if Ukraine is a candidate country. So I think whichever way you slice it, you know, whether it's for geopolitical reasons, for domestic reforms, right, like EU candidate status, with then Ukraine going through, you know, the actual steps that necessary to fulfill for each of the chapters of the acquis, is really the way to go. That would be best, both kind of geopolitically and domestically for Ukraine.
Let me just add that I think this distinction between fast track status in a perspective is really crucial. Actually, I think Ukraine is better off without fast track status, because as some couple of people have said, it's the leverage that matters, and the longer and the more deep that the EU leverage is, the more tightly Ukraine is held to that rule book, the better off Ukraine will be. Now, to get back to David's original question, which is this likely? There's still a lot of, let's just say, very pro-Russian sentiment in Europe. There's still a lot of sentiment in Europe that, if not pro-Russian, at least accepts Russia's definition of what Ukraine is, and so on and so forth. And so I'm not talking about, when I talk about Ukraine, a membership perspective, I'm talking about a long-term perspective. But even then, I'm not especially optimistic. I think there's all kinds of signs that the Europeans and European leaders in particular are going to say the right things, but try to do as little as possible, right? And I think about what the United Kingdom or what the United States has done in terms of accepting Ukrainian refugees, which is the press conferences have been great. The rest of it, not so much.
So in order for Ukraine to achieve EU membership, there has to be significant political reform in the country. So building on a couple questions in the chat, how stable are Ukrainian politics right now? Are politicians on board with meeting some of these conditions if the EU was to extend the hand? And then Susan's question as well, what are the incentives for oligarchs to buy in to some of this new rhetoric? Because it's not just a demand question, it's also a supply question of whether or not the Ukraine can meet its commitments and if candidate status or fast track status was confirmed. Any thoughts on the current domestic political situation and how it fits into some of these debates about integration with the West, either from an EU or a NATO perspective?
Yeah, if I may start, as a long time critic of the present government of Mr. Zelensky, so let me start. I would say that definitely the war actually boosted the popularity of Zelensky, who is a chief commander-in-chief, and which is natural, and we have basically a unity now in the parliament regarding many laws, and also the authority which was given to commander-in-chief under the martial law. I would say that look, we still have differences of opinions regarding also what's going on right now. But I would say that this the criticism exists within Ukraine, but it's muted. So everybody understands that this is war, and we need to cooperate in order to fight, in order to win. So I would say that position of Mr. Zelensky, of President Zelensky, is quite stable. Nobody is going to overthrow him or to organize Maidans here. So yes, we work together, and the opposition work with the government, despite some differences and mutual criticism. Okay, despite. Regarding the oligarchs and the future of the country, it's always stressed in the discussion within Ukraine that we are fighting not only for our independence, but we are fighting for new Ukraine. Ukraine, which would be democratic, which would be dominated by the rule of law, without oligarchs and without corruption. How realistic it is? Yes, we understand that there would be the road is long and difficult. The oligarchs right now, they are also not very visible. I would say that they would try to return, but objectively, I think there is a potential to limit the influence, because this will be a new society after the war. After every Maidan, there was a move forward with reforms. Sometimes not very successful, but still there was a movement forward. And I believe that after the war, we will come from this fire as purified. So the dangers will continue to, the danger, democracy is a constant fight. So regarding the stability also of Zelensky, I would like also, where's the danger to this stability? I think it's also connected with potential compromises to Russia, which are discussed and which are imposed on Ukraine, or there is an attempt to impose these compromises on Ukraine, also regarding the territory, the conditions of peace. So let me again demonstrate what are the views of Ukrainians. Yes, here it is. No, sorry. Sorry.
Yes, we see it.
Oh, you see it. I don't see it somehow, but you see it. Okay. Okay, here it is. Okay, so you see, this is again the question from our recent face-to-face poll. Again, reservation is that it's done in the West and the center of the country, but you see that people are not going to refuse NATO, to exchange NATO membership for peace. They are not ready to recognize Crimea as part of Russia, neither to recognize the occupation of the part of the Donbass. So again, if the West is pressing too much on the Ukrainian government to accept these painful conditions, this may create domestic problems. This may create also problems for the government. So I believe it's necessary to take into account when we hear that Ukraine need to do this or that, to make concessions to Russia. You cannot do it without Ukrainians. And by Ukrainians, I mean not only the government, but also Ukrainian society. Thank you.
Thank you, Oleksiy. Any other comments on Ukraine's domestic situation and the effect of the war, or even relationship with security guarantees going forward?
Yeah, I just like to add, first of all, I completely agree with Oleksiy. Zelensky is actually very much caught between a West with one notion of what's realistic and a Ukrainian population with a very different notion of what's realistic in terms of negotiating a settlement. And that's going to be a real problem for him going forward. The other thing is since I happen to be one who thinks that this war might drag on for some time, in 2024, right, roughly 2 years from now, and plus a little bit, Ukraine's supposed to have elections again. And I think things get very interesting for Ukraine and Ukrainian politics if it has to carry out parliamentary and presidential elections in a war. That is a tricky time for any democracy. And I would simply say, again, I think it's where the influence of the European Union could be massively helpful should the EU decide to engage.
Any other thoughts before moving on? I also want to encourage people from the audience. We're happy to relay any questions over to the panelists. The last slide that Oleksiy put up, makes some interesting points about the low support for recognizing the LNR, DNR, and Crimea. How can there be integration with Western structures if these regions or oblasts are still marked by an unresolved status or potentially contested? What is the way forward? Can we think past a recognition of these oblasts one way or the other? And what is with these three places hanging in the balance, how does that affect the negotiation of different types of security guarantees?
If I may start, because I hear these questions for 4 years since 2014. First of all, if we are talking about integration into EU, we have the example of Cyprus, right, where northern part is basically occupied by Turkey, and the other part is within the EU. But if we are talking about NATO, we have an example which in many discussions is lost somehow. We have Western Germany. Western Germany was divided, right? The borders were not recognized by Germans as well, themselves. Okay, and still the West Germany was integrated in NATO, and the West Berlin was actually under NATO protection. Though West Berlin formally wasn't part of West Germany, but still it was under NATO protection. So it's possible, but there should be a political will and something else. And also I would like to remind the specific case is about West Germany is also that when West Germany was integrated into NATO, the main opposition party, Social Democrats, were strongly against it. They were in favor of neutrality. So here Ukraine is much better situation because we have the ruling party and the opposition are working in the one direction. So it's possible, but you need to have political will and correct English word, guts, right? To have guts, okay.
Well, let me jump in then. I think Oleksiy is right. I think in particular, if you think about the internal politics of NATO, the naysayers, those who oppose admitting Ukraine to NATO, will seize on that issue as a reason to veto Ukraine's NATO membership. That will be the effect, regardless of the history of Germany. it provides a very convenient reason. I think there's a bigger question that I want to come back to, because this gets to this question of commitments. If there's a quote unquote peace agreement that leaves the status of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts and Crimea up in the air, you're going to have another war sometime down the road. I mean, maybe not. Maybe you can freeze it till the end of time, like Cyprus, or like we thought, those of us who are as old as I am thought was going to be the case with West Germany. But maybe not. So again, so a commitment to say we're going to solve those things sometime in the future, that essentially is what the Minsk agreement was. And sometimes those things work, but often is not. And there's a lot of literature on this. Often is not. These sort of partition and temporary solutions don't work. They lead to renewed war. And so it seems to me that, again, to escape this commitment problem, the ideal solution to this war is one that actually settles these issues. We agree on what's going to be Ukraine's and on what's going to be Russia's, and everybody says those are the borders we're now going to fight over, and we're not going to kick it down the road to sometime in the future, because that becomes another excuse for all kinds of political shenanigans and eventually for another invasion. I realize that too is very idealistic, but I think this all plays together, which is if we leave territory in limbo, and of course there's solutions out there that say we should leave all of Ukraine in limbo, create some kind of gray zone. This is the neutrality proposal in essence. If things are in limbo, there's going to be more conflict over them in the future.
Actually, David, okay, sorry.
No, just I agree and disagree with Paul at the same time. You see, the issues of Donbass and Crimea, they are different. And I will give you an example. In August 2020, we had a closed survey for the UNDP among the veterans in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And just for you to understand, so in the cities where we see right now a very fierce fighting, I mean, the cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, we met with the veterans, and they said that in both cities, they have, in each city, they have about 1,000 of veterans, meaning veterans who fought on a zero level. It calls on a very, 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 very front line between 2014 and 2020. 1,000 people motivated, united into their organizations. And right now, why they see a fierce battle in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk is that these people are fighting there actually for their homes, and they will not let the Russians to stay there, and they will not let Russians to stay in any part of the Donetsk Lugansk region, because that means the threat to their families, to themselves. So that means that Donbass would be, so there is no way but to liberate Donbass. And with Crimea, it's a different issue, and we discussed it with the Paul in our email exchange. So the point is that Ukraine is not going to fight for the territories or for the safety of the sea routes, because terrain and the sea is just a theater of projection of the powers. And if Russia remains hostile, it doesn't mean that Ukraine will never believe that Russians would respect the commitments, that authoritarian Russia would respect the commitment of the peace treaty. So yes, leaving Crimea in limbo, if Russia is authoritarian, meaning the next war and the next Russian invasion. But if we imagine, which is highly unlikely, that regime in Russia changes, then I just would put a question mark here.
If I may, David, because you use this abbreviation, LNR and DNR, and actually after the start of the war since February 24th, we still have questions from some Western journalists why Ukraine didn't give autonomy, didn't recognize LNR and DNR, because it was in Minsk agreements. No terms LNR and DNR in Minsk agreements. That's very important to understand. It's not about autonomy of these regions, within Ukraine. It's about, self-government on the local level of the occupied territories. Well, David, I know that you know that, but for some other people. So LNR and DNR didn't exist in Minsk agreements, full stop. And now, especially after, after February 24th, it's more than clear that there's no Elena and Diana. It's the territory which is controlled by Russian army, and it's since 2014, and we Ukrainians, we were trying to explain it to the Western audience, that they are not an independent players at all. And even now, you see on France 24, they talk about separatists, and even on CNN, you have this wonderful map where you see Russia-backed Russia-backed separatists control. You see the part of the occupied Donbass, it's called Russia-backed separatists control. So, and if you don't know the situation, you can imagine looking at this CNN map, that this part of the territory is controlled by Russia-backed separatists. Come on, guys, what we are talking about? It's occupied by the Russian army. And my PONARS fellows, they know that I'm fighting with CNN in order to remove this subtitle from CNN map. And I am lost. Even with support of my friends, we are not able to persuade CNN that there's no Russia-backed separatist controlled territories, that this is just the territories occupied by the Russian army. So that's why we need to remind to the Western audience, don't talk about separatists. It's Russian army, it's Russian occupation, it's Russian war.
Can I just jump in just a couple of points to this discussion? Something that Mariya and I mentioned in our memo, and I think it speaks to kind of broader suggestion maybe that we would make, that with this current situation, I think we are at a time when international community and Western actors and domestic actors too should think about sort of outside the box, right? We cannot necessarily approach, I think, the situation with sort of the sense of normal that we had before, right? Like if you engage with Russia, Russia has its reasonable concerns, right? You address security concerns, it's gonna go home and like pack its troops, right? Like that's not what happened. I mean, as you know, several of us already said, like that's not why Russia attacked, right? It doesn't want Ukraine to be a sovereign state. Like how do we deal with this, right? So by the same logic, right, what we were saying, that this point that say NATO cannot admit countries, doesn't admit countries that have quote unquote territorial dispute. Like, is this not really territorial dispute, right? Like this is an illegal annexation, right? The Crimea is not some sort of disputed territory. It's, sovereign territory of Ukraine that Russia illegally seized, right? The same goes for Donbass. So maybe there is a time, I mean, we don't have any specific recommendations, certainly we didn't make one in the memo, but we try to signal, right, that like these terms matter, right? Kind of rethinking of the situation matters. So if there is, NATO may want to think about it differently, right? Like, what does it mean? In case of Ukraine, it's not really disputed territory, it's illegal annexed territory. Does it change things? Should it change things, right? Like these probably should be the conversations. Now, second point I want to make, I think, like, several of us said, Zelensky said so himself, like he doesn't really see Ukraine trying to take NATO, trying to take over Crimea militarily, right? He signaled that, like that's now, but that doesn't mean that, Ukraine or the, as Paul was talking about it earlier too, or Western community would just say, okay, Russia, well, you kind of like, you get to keep it, right? That's sort of like the end of it. That would be bad for all sorts of reasons, itself. So I think it's sort of in an ironic way, in a way, Russia, right? Yes, they claim that, they restored what they consider to be historical justice, so forth. But I think that's going to be a thorn in their relationship with the civilized world, potentially forever, right? Like this is the thing, right? Like you can't just kind of, I know they don't want to talk about it, like they consider the matter closed, so forth, but it's, the West shouldn't be kind of taken by this gaslighting that like, that's a closed question, let's not talk about it, right? And as long as it remains a point of contention, as long as it remains a pressure point, as long as it produces sanctions, there would be, again, if we think long term, right, like in some post-Putin Russia, there could be other ways to think about Crimea, right? And again, this sort of talks about, the point about uncommon solutions, right? Like some new ways to think about it. Could Crimea be governed some sort of like Bosnia? Like, I mean, I'm not saying I have a solution, but I'm just saying that this sort of like, either Ukraine takes it over militarily and Russia is kicked out of there, which seems unrealistic, right? Or Russia just gets to keep it and, we go back to business normal with Russia, which Mariya and I would also argue that's a mistake, right? Again, as long as that, pressure remains, some potentially down the road, some other solution could be found, right? So I guess with broader comment that I'm making, that this time to kind of rethink global arrangements, right? Like that probably now is a high time, if there ever was, for different diplomatic solutions and possible different ways of thinking about these kinds of issues.
Well, thank you very much, Oksana. And I want to, we're just about out of time. So I want to thank all 6 of you for taking the time both to write such thoughtful memos, which I encourage everyone in the audience to read. They're all posted on the PONARS Eurasia website. The link is in the chat, but also for contributing your thoughts over the last hour and a half. I know I've learned a lot, and I think the debate has been really fruitful and illuminating in many ways. So thank you all very, very much. And we look forward to reading more of your commentary going forward.
And I would like to express gratitude to our wonderful moderator, and also our gratitude to PONARS leadership and PONARS members and staff for organizing this policy exchange. How it's called? Policy exchange.
Policy exchange. Yes. Thank you very much
Okay.
to Sarah for organizing this event, and for Sasha for editing the memos and building the website. Thank you very much for everybody who put their hard work into putting this first ever policy exchange together.
Thanks very much, everybody. That was great.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.